Before we begin, I need you to understand something. This isn't just a story about a bizarre industrial accident in Boston. This is a story about the price of progress, about corporate negligence on a scale that would reshape American law, about how the pursuit of profit during wartime can transform something as innocent as molasses into a weapon that would claim lives and haunt a city for generations. On a winter day in 1919, a wave of sweetness became a tsunami of death, moving at 35 miles per hour through crowded streets, crushing everything in its path. 21 people died, 150 were injured, buildings were obliterated, horses drowned in syrup. Children were swallowed whole by a substance that should have brought joy, not terror. And the consequences of that single moment would change how America built its cities, regulated its industries, and protected its workers forever. Before you settle in for this journey through time, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. Are you settling in for sleep in London? Starting your evening in Tokyo? Winding down after a long day in New York? I always love hearing from you. Phone away, distractions silenced. Get comfortable. Tonight, we're going to trace the complete history of one of the most unusual disasters in American history, from the ancient origins of molasses itself, through the Industrial Revolution that made it a commodity worth killing for, to that terrible day in Boston, and finally to its lasting legacy in law and memory. Let's begin. In the beginning, there was sweetness. Long before refined sugar, long before the factories and the tanks and the tragedy we'll eventually arrive at, humanity craved something to cut the bitterness of existence. Our story begins not in Boston, but thousands of miles away and thousands of years in the past, in the tropical regions where a tall grass would change the course of human history. Sugarcane, Saccharum officinarum. Its origins trace back perhaps 10,000 years to New Guinea, where indigenous peoples first discovered that the thick stems of this particular grass contained a sweet juice unlike anything else growing wild. They would cut the stalks and chew them, extracting the precious liquid, spitting out the fibrous remains. It was a simple pleasure, a gift from the earth. Picture those early tropical gardens, if you can. The air thick with humidity, heavy with the scent of rich soil and decaying vegetation. The sugarcane growing in dense clusters, its long blade-like leaves rustling in the warm breeze, stalks reaching 10, 12, 15 feet tall. The people who cultivated it understood its value, but they could never have imagined where this plant would lead humanity. They couldn't have foreseen the empires that would rise and fall over control of this grass. They couldn't have envisioned the millions who would toil and die in the fields where it grew. And they certainly couldn't have imagined a cold January day in Massachusetts when their sweet discovery would become a killer. From New Guinea, sugarcane spread slowly across the ancient world. By 8000 BCE, it had reached the Philippines and India. The people of ancient India developed increasingly sophisticated methods of processing the juice. They discovered that by crushing the cane between wooden rollers and then boiling the extracted liquid, they could create crystals of concentrated sweetness. They called it sharkara, the origin of our word sugar. But the crystals weren't the only product. There was always a residue, a thick, dark syrup left behind after the sugar crystallized. This was the ancestor of molasses. The first chapter of this story takes us to ancient Persia and Arabia around 500 CE, where sugar production became an art form. Persian chemists and cooks developed more refined techniques, discovering that the leftover syrup, this dark, viscous liquid we now call molasses, had its own value. It could be used in cooking, in medicine, even in the fermentation of alcoholic beverages. The Arabic word for the substance was molasses, meaning sticky or viscous. Through Arabic traders, this word would eventually become molasses. As Islam spread across North Africa and into Spain during the medieval period, so too did the cultivation of sugarcane and the production of its byproducts. By the 8th century, extensive sugarcane plantations stretched across the Islamic world, from Spain to Persia, from Egypt to Morocco. These plantations required immense labor. The work was backbreaking, cutting sugarcane in tropical heat, your hands torn and bleeding from the sharp leaves, your back aching from the endless bending and lifting, the sweet juice mixing with your sweat and the dirt and the blood. Already, even in these early centuries, sugar production was associated with human suffering. The Crusades would bring European Christians into direct contact with sugar and molasses. Crusader knights returning from the Holy Land brought back tastes for exotic spices and sweeteners. Sugar was a luxury worth its weight in gold, available only to the wealthiest nobles.
Molasses, cheaper and more readily available, became somewhat more accessible, used primarily for medicinal purposes. Medieval European physicians believed molasses had healing properties, good for digestive ailments, useful as a cough remedy, even thought to purify the blood. But it was the age of exploration that would transform molasses from an exotic curiosity into a commodity that would reshape the world economy and ultimately lead to the tragedy we're building toward. When Christopher Columbus set sail in 1492, he carried sugarcane cuttings on his second voyage in 1493. The Caribbean islands, he realized, had the perfect climate for sugarcane cultivation: warm temperatures year-round, abundant rainfall, rich volcanic soil. It was paradise for the plant, even as it would become hell for those forced to harvest it. Within 50 years of Columbus's voyages, sugarcane plantations had spread across the Caribbean. The Spanish established them in Cuba and Hispaniola. The Portuguese developed massive operations in Brazil. And as European powers fought over these tropical islands, they were really fighting over sugar, and by extension, molasses. The sweet grass from New Guinea had become the foundation of a global economic system. Moving into the 16th and 17th centuries, we see the emergence of what historians call the triangle trade, and this is where molasses becomes central to our story. The system was elegantly simple and morally horrific. Ships would leave ports in England or New England loaded with manufactured goods, textiles, weapons, tools. These ships would sail to West Africa, where the cargo would be traded for human beings, captured or purchased from African slave traders. The ships would then cross the Atlantic in the infamous Middle Passage, carrying enslaved Africans to the Caribbean and South America. There, the enslaved people would be sold to plantation owners, and the ships would be loaded with sugar, molasses, and rum for the return voyage to Europe or North America. But let's focus specifically on molasses in this triangle, because this is where New England enters our story. The Caribbean plantations produced vast quantities of molasses as a byproduct of sugar refining. The molasses had relatively little value in the Caribbean itself, but New England merchants discovered it had tremendous value back home. Molasses could be distilled into rum, and rum was enormously profitable. By the late 1600s, rum distillation had become one of New England's most important industries. The second chapter reveals the true scale of this molasses trade. By 1700, there were at least 30 rum distilleries operating in Massachusetts alone. Rhode Island had more than 20. Rum became the currency of New England, used in trade with Native Americans, with the fishing fleets, shipped back to Africa to purchase more enslaved people, to produce more sugar, to create more molasses, to make more rum. The cycle fed itself, and molasses was the blood that kept it pumping. Let's visit Boston Harbor in 1720. The waterfront is crowded with ships, their masts creating a forest of wood and rope. The air is thick with the smell of saltwater, fish, tar, and underlying everything else, the heavy, sweet, sour smell of molasses. Barrels are being rolled down gangplanks, each one containing about 60 gallons of thick, dark syrup shipped up from Barbados or Jamaica or Hispaniola. The barrels are heavy, awkward, dangerous to move. Dock workers strain under the weight, and accidents are common. A dropped barrel might split open, spilling gallons of sticky molasses onto the cobblestones, where it would congeal into a mess that took days to clean properly. The distilleries themselves were substantial operations, large brick or wooden buildings, usually located near the waterfront for easy access to shipping. Inside, enormous copper stills gleamed in the firelight. The process of turning molasses into rum required heating the molasses, adding water and yeast, allowing fermentation, and then distilling the resulting liquid through a complex process that separated the alcohol from water and other components. The distilleries ran constantly, their fires never cooling, the smell of fermentation and distillation permeating the surrounding neighborhoods. By the mid-1700s, New England was importing millions of gallons of molasses annually. The substance had become so central to the economy that when the British Parliament passed the Molasses Act in 1733, attempting to restrict trade with non-British colonies, it caused outrage in the American colonies. The act imposed a prohibitive tax on molasses imported from non-British sources. New England merchants largely ignored the law, smuggling molasses on a massive scale. Some historians argue that this early resistance to British trade restrictions over molasses helped plant the seeds of revolutionary sentiment that would eventually lead to American independence. The irony is profound. The substance that would one day kill 21 people in Boston was, in a very real sense, part of what gave birth to America itself. The resistance to the Molasses Act was a precursor to the more famous resistance to the Stamp Act and the tea tax. When colonists threw tea into Boston Harbor in 1773, they might just as easily have been defending molasses. The American Revolution was fought in part to protect the right to freely trade in this sweet, sticky substance. Throughout the late 18th century and into the 19th, molasses remained central to American life, particularly in coastal cities. It wasn't just about rum anymore. Molasses was a staple food ingredient used in baking and the production of a cheap sweetener called treacle, mixed with herbs for medicinal purposes.
Before we begin, I need you to understand something. This isn't just a story about a bizarre industrial accident in Boston. This is a story about the price of progress, about corporate negligence on a scale that would reshape American law, about how the pursuit of profit during wartime can transform something as innocent as molasses into a weapon that would claim lives and haunt a city for generations. On a winter day in 1919, a wave of sweetness became a tsunami of death, moving at 35 miles per hour through crowded streets, crushing everything in its path. 21 people died, 150 were injured, buildings were obliterated, horses drowned in syrup. Children were swallowed whole by a substance that should have brought joy, not terror. And the consequences of that single moment would change how America built its cities, regulated its industries, and protected its workers forever. Before you settle in for this journey through time, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. Are you settling in for sleep in London? Starting your evening in Tokyo? Winding down after a long day in New York? I always love hearing from you. Phone away, distractions silenced. Get comfortable. Tonight, we're going to trace the complete history of one of the most unusual disasters in American history, from the ancient origins of molasses itself, through the Industrial Revolution that made it a commodity worth killing for, to that terrible day in Boston, and finally to its lasting legacy in law and memory. The wave continued outward in all directions, following the path of least resistance, but also simply demolishing everything in its way. It hit the elevated railway structure, and the steel supports built to hold the weight of trains buckled and twisted like paper clips. A section of the elevated track collapsed, the steel beams falling into the street. Houses were ripped from their foundations. The wave hit a row of wooden tenement buildings, and they simply came apart, the walls blowing out, the roofs collapsing, the people inside suddenly finding themselves not in their homes, but tumbling in a dark, sticky nightmare. Horses in the street, dozens of them pulling wagons, never had a chance. The wave picked them up, carried them along, and then buried them. The horses struggled, fought to keep their heads above the surface, but molasses is not like water. You can't swim in molasses. It's too thick, too heavy. The horses suffocated, drowned in sweetness. Antonio D'Estasio and his 4-year-old sister Pasquale were on their way home from the store. They were on Commercial Street when the tank ruptured. Witnesses saw the wave pick them up and carry them away. Antonio's body was recovered the next day. Pasquale's body was found 4 days later, pulled from the molasses that had buried her. Bridget Clufferty, collecting firewood, was directly in the path of the wave. She disappeared. Her body was recovered days later, so covered in molasses and so battered by debris that she was initially unrecognizable. George Leahy, walking home, was picked up by the wave and thrown against a building. He died from his injuries. The wave spread outward for several blocks, gradually slowing as it dispersed and as the molasses spread out into a thinner layer. But even as it slowed, it remained incredibly dangerous. People caught in it found themselves stuck, unable to move, the molasses acting like quicksand. The more they struggled, the more tired they became, and some simply gave up, exhausted, and drowned where they stood. The molasses was everywhere, covering everything. Commercial Street was buried under a layer 2 to 3 feet deep. Side streets had molasses flowing down them like rivers. Basements filled with molasses. First-floor apartments were flooded. The substance oozed into every crack, every crevice, every opening. And the smell. Survivors talked about the smell for the rest of their lives. Overwhelmingly sweet, sickly sweet, the smell of molasses mixed with the smell of death and destruction. It permeated everything, soaked into clothing and hair and skin, and it wouldn't wash out, not completely, not ever. The immediate aftermath was chaos. People screaming, calling for help, searching for loved ones. The molasses made movement almost impossible. Rescuers trying to reach victims found themselves stuck, wading through waist-deep molasses that clung to their legs like cement. Some rescuers had to be rescued themselves, exhausted from fighting against the substance. But help was coming. Fire departments from across Boston responded. Police arrived. Sailors from a nearby naval station came with equipment and manpower. The United States Army sent soldiers. Everyone who came to help faced the same nightmarish conditions. How do you rescue someone buried in molasses? How do you even find them? The molasses was opaque, dark brown, almost black. You couldn't see into it. Rescuers used poles in their hands, probing the molasses, searching for bodies, sometimes finding survivors who had somehow managed to keep their heads above the surface, clinging to debris, barely conscious. The temperature, which had been unseasonably warm, began to drop as evening approached.
As the temperature fell, the molasses began to thicken, to congeal, becoming even more difficult to work with. What had been a viscous liquid slowly turned into something like cold tar, sticky and resistant. However, let me pause here and tell you about some of the rescuers, because their actions that day were nothing short of heroic. We'll return to the immediate aftermath in a moment, but these people deserve recognition. Lieutenant John M. Barry as Higher Station 31 survived the initial collapse of the firehouse. He was injured, but he immediately began working to rescue his fellow firefighters. Despite his own injuries, despite the shock of what had just happened, Barry waded into the molasses, searching for his men. He helped pull several firefighters from the wreckage of the station house, saving lives even as he was injured himself. Sailors from the USS Nantucket, was docked nearby, came running when they heard the explosion. These young sailors, most of them teenagers or in their early 20s, plunged into the molasses without hesitation. They formed human chains, passing victims hand to hand from the worst areas to safer ground. Some of these sailors had joined the Navy hoping to see action in the war which had just ended a few months earlier. Instead, they found themselves fighting a different kind of battle against sweetness and suffocation. Civilian volunteers came from throughout the North End, people who lived in the neighborhood, who knew the victims, who simply couldn't stand by while their neighbors died. One account mentions a woman, never identified, who stood at the edge of the molasses field for hours holding a rope that rescuers could grab if they got into trouble. Her arms must have been exhausted, but she never left her post. The rescue efforts continued through the night, illuminated by spotlights and torches. The scene must have looked like something from Dante's Inferno, dark figures moving through a landscape of brown, sticky substance, pulling bodies from the wreckage, calling out names, listening for responses. The searchlights casting strange shadows, the smell overwhelming, the cold intensifying as the night went on, the molasses thickening further, making everything more difficult. By dawn on January 16th, it was clear that this was one of the worst industrial disasters in Boston's history. The death toll was rising as more bodies were recovered. The injured numbered over 100. The destruction was unlike anything the city had seen. Buildings destroyed, the elevated railway damaged, streets impassable, and molasses everywhere, an impossible mess that nobody knew how to clean up. In the days that followed, the full scale of the tragedy became clear. The final death toll was 21 people. 151 people were injured, some seriously, some with injuries that would affect them for the rest of their lives. Dozens of horses were dead. Buildings had been destroyed or damaged. Property damage was estimated at over $100 million in today's money. But the numbers don't tell the whole story. The numbers don't capture the human tragedy. The families destroyed, the children orphaned, the lives forever changed. Let me tell you about some of the victims, the ones we know about, the ones whose names were recorded, whose stories were preserved. Maria DeStasio lost both her children that day, Antonio, age 10, and Pasquale, age 4. Imagine being Maria. You sent your children on a simple errand to buy something at the local store. It was daytime. It was a routine task that they'd done dozens of times before, and they never came home. For the rest of her life, Maria blamed herself. Even though there was nothing she could have done, no way she could have known, she had sent her children into death. Cesare Nicola was a worker at the Boston Elevated Railway. He was 40 years old, married, with children. He was working in the maintenance building when the wave hit. The building collapsed and Cesare was buried. His body was recovered the next day. Flaminio Gallerani was 37, an Italian immigrant who worked as a laborer. He was on Commercial Street when the tank ruptured. His body was so badly mangled by debris in the molasses that he could only be identified by papers in his pocket. James J. Kennelly, the dock worker I mentioned earlier, was at work when the wave hit. He tried to run, witnesses say, but the molasses caught him, knocked him down, and buried him. He was 48 years old. I could go on. Each of the 21 dead had a story. Each was a person with hopes and fears and dreams. Each left behind grieving family members. Each death was a tragedy. The injured suffered terribly. Many had been burned by the molasses. This might seem strange, but freshly stored molasses retains heat, and the molasses that burst from the tank was warm, almost hot. It caused burns on exposed skin. Additionally, many victims had been scraped and cut by debris. The molasses contaminated these wounds, making them prone to infection. Several of those initially listed as injured would later die from complications. The cleanup of the disaster took weeks and consumed enormous resources. How do you clean up millions of gallons of molasses spread over several city blocks? The molasses had flown into the harbor, where it killed fish and contaminated the water. It had soaked into wooden buildings, into cobblestones, into earth and stone and brick. It had gotten into the sewers, clogging a drainage system. Rescuers used salt water from the harbor, pumped onto the streets to help dissolve the molasses. They used shovels and squeegees and anything else they could think of. The Boston Fire Department brought fire hoses and simply sprayed everything down, washing molasses into the harbor, into the sewers, anywhere to get it off the streets. It took over 87,000 man-hours to clean up the mess, and even then they never got all of it. For years afterwards, decades afterwards, on hot summer days, residents of the North End would sometimes catch a whiff of molasses. Some claims you could still smell it as late as the 1950s, more than 30 years after the disaster. The immediate question, once the rescue efforts were complete and the cleanup was underway, was simple. Why did this happen? And more importantly, who was responsible? The United States Industrial Alcohol Company initially tried to deflect blame. In the first statements after the disaster, USAA suggested that the tank had been sabotaged, possibly by anarchists. This was not as absurd as it might sound. The period around World War I saw a wave of anarchist activity in the United States, including bombings and other acts of political violence. Boston had a significant anarchist community, primarily among Italian immigrants. USAA suggested that anarchists might have planted a bomb in the tank, causing it to explode. This explanation was quickly dismissed. Investigators found no evidence of explosives. The pattern of damage was consistent with a structural failure, not a bomb. The anarchist theory was in the end simply an attempt by USAA to avoid responsibility. Lawsuits were filed almost immediately. The victims and their families sued USAA for negligence. This would become one of the first major class action lawsuits in American history, and the legal battle would drag on for years, becoming a landmark case in the development of corporate liability law. The case was heard by Auditor Hugh W. Ogden, who was appointed to investigate the disaster and determine responsibility. Ogden's investigation was exhaustive. It lasted over 3 years and heard testimony from over 1,000 witnesses. Engineers examined the wreckage of the tank. Scientists studied the properties of molasses. Eyewitnesses described what they had seen. USAA's records were subpoenaed and examined. What emerged from this investigation was a damning portrait of corporate negligence. USAA had built the tank without proper engineering oversight. They had used substandard materials. They had ignored warning signs, the leaking, the groaning, the complaints from neighbors. They had prioritized profit over safety at every turn. When problems emerged, they had hidden them rather than fixing them. The case also revealed something darker. The employees who had designed and overseen the construction of the tank had falsified records. They had claimed inspections had been performed when they hadn't. They had signed off on work that hadn't been completed properly. They had lied, systematically and repeatedly, about the safety of the tank. In 1925, 6 years after the disaster, Auditor Ogden released his findings. USAA was found to be responsible for the disaster. The company was ordered to pay damages to the victims and their families. The total payout was around $628,000, equivalent to perhaps $10 million today. This might seem like a small amount, but it was a significant sum at the time, and more importantly, the legal precedent was established. Companies could be held liable for disasters caused by their negligence. But let's step back for a moment and consider the broader implications of the molasses flood, because this disaster didn't just affect the immediate victims. It changed how America built things, how it regulated